Snow falls quietly over the spires of Salzburg, veiling old sins in silence. A train cuts through the Alps like a silver thread, unraveling secrets long buried. In its velvet-lined compartments, strangers sit too still, their past stitched into every glance, every lie left unspoken. Justice waits, not with judgment, but with sorrow, and in the echo of a forgotten melody, truth finds its final note. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from, and what time it is. Let me know in the comments. Let's step into the shadows of the past together. It was one of those curious decisions of Poirot's that bore all the markings of spontaneity, and yet, I suspect, had been weighed with his usual precision. We had been wintering in Paris, the grey skies casting their usual pall over the boulevards, when my friend looked up from his morning tisane and announced, with almost childlike satisfaction, "Hastings, we shall take the Salzburg Express." I blinked at him, unsure I had heard aright. The Salzburg Express? But we've no business in Austria. Exactly, said he, dabbing his moustache delicately with a monogrammed napkin. No business, no obligations, merely a journey, one of beauty, tranquility, and perhaps, if we are fortunate, the melody of silence. I had grown accustomed to these flights of fancy, which more often than not led us directly into the heart of some dark entanglement. Yet something about the way he said it, the gleam in his eye, the faint tilt of his head, suggested a deeper motive. Perhaps it was merely the call of the mountains, or perhaps it was something more. Regardless, we booked 2 adjoining compartments that very afternoon, and by the following evening we were gliding eastward beneath the lavender dusk, unaware that the journey would carry us far deeper into the shadows than we anticipated. There are few pleasures more refined than travel by train when done properly, and the Salzburg Express was, without question, the very embodiment of continental elegance. The carriages, polished to a dark gleam, seemed to hum with quiet expectation. Porters in neatly pressed uniforms moved with graceful efficiency, their every movement calculated to reassure and serve. The brass fixtures gleamed, the windows were draped in burgundy velvet, and each compartment bore the scent of lavender polish and something more elusive, perhaps cedarwood, or the faintest trace of pipe tobacco. Poirot, of course, treated the experience with the reverence of a man in a cathedral. He examined our compartment with a critical eye, testing the firmness of the cushions, the alignment of the table lamp, even the symmetry of the luggage rack. "Mon ami," he declared, "one may learn everything about a nation from how it designs its trains." He had just finished adjusting the curtains by a matter of inches when the train gave a gentle lurch forward, and we began our nocturnal passage through the Alps. Outside, the snowy slopes slipped by in silence, while inside the carriage, we settled into the velvet-lined peace that would, all too soon, be interrupted. As we sipped our coffee in the dining saloon, Poirot's eyes wandered not over the menu, but over the people. He was never more content than when among strangers, particularly those unaware they were being observed. I, too, began to take note. There was a woman of striking posture seated 2 tables across, a widow, I thought, dressed in somber tones with a veil drawn delicately across her brow. Her fingers were long and still, save for the way they gently turned the pages of a leather-bound book. She struck me as a woman accustomed to silence. At the far end of the carriage, a man of diplomatic bearing occupied a table alone. He wore a dark suit and read the Neue Freche Press with the careful absorption of someone who wanted to be seen reading. His expression was unreadable, his movements too precise, like a man performing neutrality rather than feeling it. In the corridor earlier we had passed a stocky Hungarian gentleman who had nearly bowled over the porter in his impatience. His voice, gravelly and commanding, carried through the corridor as he barked orders in a clipped German accent. He had the air of a man who had once commanded troops and had not yet adjusted to civilian irrelevance. But it was the fourth that held Poirot's attention longest, a young woman, perhaps in her mid-twenties, seated alone in a corner table with a teacup untouched before her. She had fair hair swept into a chignon, and although she wore a travelling suit of impeccable modesty, something about her seemed adrift. Her eyes, grey or perhaps blue, darted about the room without ever resting. She was watching everything, but never meeting a gaze. Poirot leaned closer and murmured, "That one, Hastings. She is not afraid of the strangers. No, no, she is afraid of someone she already knows." I looked again at the nervous young woman. Something in her posture, upright yet uncertain, seemed to whisper of an unease, not born of the present, but of something carried, and as the train sped deeper into the night, I began to wonder what could such a collection of travellers possibly have in common, save the route they shared. Dinner aboard the Salzburg Express was a quiet, dignified affair, served with that continental grace which never hurries, never fawns, but somehow manages to make one feel entirely attended to. Poirot, naturally, took his soup with meticulous care, pausing now and then to glance at his surroundings under lowered lashes. For my part, I allowed myself a second glass of the Riesling, and watched the procession of faces as they entered the dining car one by one. It was then I noticed the moment, fleeting but unmistakable. The young woman we had seen earlier, the one seated alone with the downcast eyes and nervous fingers, had just stepped through the doors. As she passed the diplomat's table, the man with the narrow nose and the unreadable face, she looked at him, not accidentally, but directly, with a flicker of something unguarded. It was recognition, I was certain of it. But the man did not return her gaze. He turned a page of his paper with glacial precision, and reached for his wine, without so much as a glance in her direction. The entire exchange, if one could call it that, took less than 3 seconds, and yet it was enough to lodge itself in my mind like a sliver. She had known him, but he had chosen not to know her. Upon returning to our compartments, Poirot at once resumed his fastidious campaign for order. He straightened the tassels on the curtain tiebacks, adjusted the angle of the reading lamp by precisely 3 degrees, and produced from his valise a small brush with which he whisked an invisible speck from the window-sill. "Hastings," he said, as he smoothed the coverlet with the care of a surgeon dressing a wound, "do you see this scuff on the linoleum? Fresh. The porter's boots do not mark so." I peered at the faint streak near the corridor junction. "Could be any passenger, but it is not," he replied, lifting an eyebrow. "The angle, it is of someone turning sharply, someone startled perhaps." As he closed the door behind him, his gaze fell upon a hat box, burgundy leather, monogrammed SV, tucked discreetly just outside the adjoining compartment. He made no remark, but I saw his fingers tap lightly against his side. As night settled across the Alpine ridges, the train gathered momentum with that gentle rhythm peculiar to long-distance travel, a subtle weaving that suggested progress and rest in equal measure. Yet the mood aboard the Salzburg Express remained oddly muted. The passengers returned to their compartments with the quiet urgency of people who preferred privacy to society. Cards were abandoned mid-game, books closed without bookmarks. Even the laughter of a pair of French businessmen down the corridor seemed curiously restrained, as if the very woodwork absorbed mirth before it could bloom. Poirot was uncharacteristically quiet. He sat, fingers templed beneath his chin, not dozing but thinking, the kind of thinking I had come to associate with his more dangerous moments of clarity. I opened my book, a volume of Austrian legends I had purchased from a kiosk in Paris, but found myself rereading the same sentence again and again. Outside, the darkness deepened, broken only by the fleeting flicker of lanterns in tiny hillside villages. Within, it was as though something had boarded the train that did not wear a ticket, something silent, but not at ease. I could not have said what disturbed me, only that something did. It was some time after midnight when I awoke, though I did not know at first what had stirred me. The train glided smoothly, the engine's breath muffled by snow, yet my ears strained in the dark, sensing something. Then I heard it, a cough, not loud, but persistent, dry, mechanical. The sort of cough one associates with fatigue, or worse, with concealment. It came from the rear of the carriage, perhaps 2 compartments beyond our own. It repeated once, then again, and then no more. I sat up, listening, but the sound did not return, only the distant creak of timber and the soft rhythmic heartbeat of the train. In the morning, I would think better of it, tell myself it was nothing, but at that hour, lying awake in the narrow berth with the shadows close around, it seemed to echo far longer than it should have. It was just after luncheon, and I had stepped into the corridor to stretch my legs. The rhythmic sway of the train gave the long passageway an undulating, dreamlike quality, and as I passed each compartment, I found myself glancing discreetly, of course, through the slender panes of frosted glass. It was in one such glance that I saw her. She sat quite alone, her posture perfectly composed, though there was nothing of ease about it. Her coat was a soft dove grey, the collar turned up slightly, as if against a remembered chill. In her gloved hands she held nothing, no book, no letter, only the stillness of someone entirely self-contained. Her eyes, pale and luminous, gazed out the window as though searching for something beyond the endless procession of snow-covered peaks. There was an air of sadness about her, though not of the demonstrative kind. Hers was a quiet sorrow, folded inward. It struck me, not for the first time on that journey, that one never quite knows what grief a fellow traveler carries. I watched her only for a moment more before continuing on, but something about her presence lingered with me, a sense of having intruded not upon privacy, but upon solitude itself. Later that afternoon, Poirot had taken to strolling the corridor under the pretense of inspecting the maintenance of the brass fittings, a transparent fiction, if ever there was one. At some point, he paused beside the steward's compartment and examined the passenger manifest tacked discreetly to the wall. I watched as his eyes travelled down the list, pausing at intervals. Then, with a small nod of interest, he tapped lightly at a name. "Clara Markowitch," he murmured. "Ah, mon ami, do you observe? A name with weight. Slavic, perhaps Polish, or Austrian-Hungarian. Not a tourist name, that. It is a name that comes from history." I made a sound of vague agreement, but Poirot had already turned, his gaze thoughtful. "She does not travel lightly," he added, "even if she carries no trunks." It was not long after that I encountered her properly. I had stepped out to fetch the evening paper from the end of the carriage when I came upon her in the corridor, bending down to retrieve something that had slipped from her gloved hand. "A moment," I said, stooping at once. "Allow me." It was a fine leather glove, pale beige with a mother-of-pearl button at the wrist, delicate, elegant, but well worn. She straightened slowly and accepted it with a faint nod. "Thank you," she said, her voice low and tinged with a faint accent I could not place. "I'm sorry." "For what?" I asked with a smile. She hesitated, the corner of her mouth moving as if she were about to answer, then thought better of it. "For troubling you," she said instead. "Not at all, Captain Arthur Hastings," I offered, ever the gallant. She gave a small, polite nod. Clara Markowitch. There was no handshake, no further pleasantry, and yet I had the strong impression that even this brief interaction had cost her something. Not discomfort, precisely, but effort. as though even courtesy had become dangerous terrain. Before I could find a pretext to continue the conversation, she had turned away with a quiet, "Good afternoon," leaving me with her name, her glove, and a distinct sense of having been gently rebuffed. When I returned to our compartment, Poirot was seated precisely as I had left him, his hands steepled beneath his chin, the tips of his polished shoes just touching the base of the opposite seat. He glanced up as I entered. "You have made the acquaintance, then?" he asked. "Only briefly," I replied, lowering myself into the seat opposite. Dropped a glove in the corridor. She thanked me, introduced herself, and left without a word more than necessary. "Ah," Poirot said with a small smile. "And what did you learn, mon cher Hastings?" I shrugged. "Only that she is not one for small talk." Poirot inclined his head slightly. "Indeed. But did you observe the manner in which she stood? The shoulders drawn upward, not with pride, but defense. The hands, gloved, yet clenched. And the eyes, those eyes, always searching, but never resting. She is a woman who expects at any moment to be spoken to by someone she dreads." "You think she's being followed?" I asked, intrigued. Poirot lifted one finger. Not followed. Watched." I felt a chill then, not from the cold, but from something in Poirot's voice, something quiet and certain, and I could not help but wonder who, among our fellow passengers, had known her before the journey began. The dining car had settled into a hush of silver cutlery and murmured French. Poirot and I had secured a table toward the middle, just as dessert was being brought in. The chocolate mousse was of such refinement that even Poirot offered it a small nod of approval, a rare compliment in itself. It was during this quiet interlude that Clara entered. She walked slowly, her gaze lowered, and took a seat at the end of the car, facing away from most of the passengers. As the steward approached with the menu, she made no attempt to speak, merely nodded once, distractedly. A moment later the diplomat appeared, the same man who had ignored her glance earlier. He passed by our table with the same composed indifference, his eyes trained on the far end of the car, but it was Clara's reaction that caught me. Her back straightened almost imperceptibly. Her fingers moved the stem of her glass and held it too tightly, and just for a second her eyes followed him, not with affection nor fear exactly, but with the dull alertness of someone registering a wound long scarred. Poirot did not look at her, yet I sensed he had noticed the same thing. Clara turned back to her table and stared into the candle's flame. When the diplomat eventually took his seat, she never once looked in his direction. But I would have wagered a considerable sum that they had once shared a room not unlike this one, somewhere long ago, under very different lights. Later that evening I made my way along the corridor, intending to retrieve the novel I had left behind in the lounge car. The train had grown quiet, the sort of hush that settles only on those who travel overnight, where the sleeping hours belong more to thought than to slumber. As I passed the second compartment on the right, the one registered to Clara Markowitch, I slowed, unthinking, perhaps out of habit. The curtain across the glass pane was drawn but thin. Just beyond it, her silhouette was faintly visible in the lamplight. She was seated upright, still fully clothed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She did not move, not to reach for a book, nor to adjust her seat. She simply sat. I remained a moment longer, then moved on, troubled not by what I had seen, but by the stillness of it. There are many ways a person may mourn, but what, I wondered, does one mourn in advance? When I returned to our compartment, I found Poirot still awake, though the lights were dimmed, and his coat had been folded with great care across his knees. He was not reading, nor speaking, simply waiting, in that fashion of his that always suggested the pieces of a puzzle were beginning to whisper. "I passed Miss Markowitz's compartment," I said. "She's still awake, sitting in the dark, just sitting." Poirot nodded slightly. "Yes, I heard her return earlier. Her step is light, but weighted, a contradiction, n'est-ce pas?" I gave a vague murmur of assent. "There is something you do not yet see, my friend," he continued gently. "You look, but you do not observe." "Oh," I said, half defensive, "you saw her face when the man passed. You saw her posture. But did you ask yourself, what kind of fear makes a woman act so composed?" I frowned. "You think she's in danger?" Poirot shook his head, his voice soft. "No, I think she is not afraid of what might happen. She is afraid of what already has." He folded his hands together, his gaze resting on the snowy darkness beyond the window. "That young woman, Hastings, is not afraid of strangers. She is afraid of someone she knows." The Salzburg express was drawing its breath for the final stretch of its journey, having begun to decelerate in the pale chill of morning. A gauze of mist clung to the windows, and the snow-draped landscape beyond looked still and eternal, as though suspended in a postcard. I had just begun to stir beneath my travelling rug when I heard the knock, a discreet rap at a door not far down the corridor. I peered blearily into the gloom, and caught sight of one of the porters standing outside a compartment, the brass number 4 glinting beneath the gaslight. "Sir," he called gently. "Monsieur Frobisher? We are approaching Virgil. The light breakfast will soon be served." There was no reply. The porter waited a moment, then rapped again, slightly firmer this time. "Sir?" I sat up, curiosity stirring. Poirot, already impeccably dressed and seated, merely raised one eyebrow. "A diplomat, I believe," he murmured. "Always discreet. But this silence, none. It is not the silence of discretion." The porter tried once more. Then, with an uncertain glance toward us, he moved off in search of the conductor. Poirot remained very still. His hands, however, had ceased their usual morning ritual of aligning the cutlery. It was not yet light, and already the first thread had loosened in what would soon unravel entirely. The return was swift. Within 5 minutes the conductor arrived with a second porter in tow, this one older, with an expression that seemed permanently etched with patient resignation. Together they approached compartment 4, and attempted the door handle with practiced discretion. Still nothing. "Sir, it is the conductor. I must ask you to respond." Silence. Poirot rose. He did not speak, merely moved closer, his head tilted slightly, as though listening not for sound, but for its absence. At last the conductor gave a nod, and with a set of brass master keys produced from his waistcoat, he fitted one into the lock. A quiet click, a pause, then a push. The door did not yield. "The bolt," the older porter said quietly. "It's secured from the inside." "Stand back, please," the conductor said, and with a short practiced movement, he leaned his shoulder into the panel. There was a dull thud, a second one, and then the catch gave way. The air that drifted out was oddly still. I stepped forward instinctively, and stopped. Julian Frobisher sat as though asleep, his head resting slightly to one side, his overcoat buttoned neatly up to his throat. One glove had fallen to the floor. His hands, pale and fine, rested on his lap, one holding a folded newspaper. But his eyes, those grey diplomatic eyes, stared straight ahead, wide and empty. The doctor was summoned without delay, but in my own heart I already knew. He had not awakened that morning, nor would he again. The on-board doctor, a wiry fellow with pince-nez and a pronounced Prussian accent, wasted no time in issuing his verdict. A cursory examination, followed by a murmured consultation with the conductor, and the phrase was spoken with bureaucratic finality. Herzversurgen, natural causes, likely exacerbated by altitude and fatigue. The porters exchanged glances. The older one muttered something about those embassy types never sleeping, and moved off with a kind of solemn efficiency. Already there was talk of discreet telegrams to Vienna, and instructions for the authorities in Salzburg. I found myself unaccountably troubled. Death, when it came this silently, always unsettled me. There had been no cry, no disturbance. The man had simply ceased, like a lamp turned low in the night. Poirot, however, did not look convinced. He stood at a distance, arms folded, one foot ever so slightly turned out, an old stance I had seen before, when something in the logic of an event offended his sense of harmony. "Too quiet, Hastings," he said, almost to himself. "Too still." "Heart failure's not uncommon," I said. He turned his eyes to me, dark, precise, and very much awake. "Yes, mon ami, but death, even natural death, leaves behind disorder. Here, there is none, and that I find curious." The dining car had opened its doors with subdued ceremony. The early risers and heavy-eyed businessmen filed in, murmuring in hushed tones, as though the air of death still lingered in the corridors. Poirot for once declined his breakfast. He stood by the window, arms behind his back, gazing not at the passing snowfields, but inward. He was alone in the compartment, I said, trying to reason the thing aloud. The door was bolted from within. No sign of struggle. It must have been natural. Poirot gave a faint sigh. "Perhaps, but let us not be too hasty. The signs, they are not always what they seem." He turned to me then, and his gaze sharpened. "Did you notice the paper in his hand?" I blinked. "Folded, wasn't it?" Across his lap. "Yes. Folded with precision, a diplomat's hand, but untouched. No ink smudge upon the fingers, no creased edge turned. He had not read it, and yet he held it." I frowned. "Perhaps he fell asleep reading." Poirot tilted his head. "Perhaps, or perhaps Hastings, he was made to appear as though he had." He began to pace lightly. "No, I shall not take breakfast. I shall take, instead, a stroll to speak, very gently with the steward. A small conversation, you understand." He straightened his cuffs with care, for when a man dies so silently, it is the noises just before that interest me most. After breakfast, with the incident already softened by the murmurs of routine, I passed once more by the now silent compartment where Mr. Frobisher had met his end. The door, though now unbolted, had been respectfully closed again. A porter, pale-faced and polite, stood guard beside it with a note of restrained authority. Poirot, as ever, had been granted access under the guise of official interest. It was only later, when he emerged, that he beckoned me over with a small nod. "He read nothing last night," he said quietly, "and yet the paper lies upon his lap with care." I followed his gaze. The newspaper, an English-language broadsheet printed in Vienna, rested precisely where it had the night before, its edges unsmudged, its pages untouched, but for a faint crease running down the center. "Look more closely, Hastings," Poirot murmured. It took me a moment, but then I saw it. One of the articles, buried near the back, in a column titled Post-War Affairs, had been lightly circled in pencil. I leaned in. "Competing claims over Vienna archives, British legal attaché delays, transfer of documents to Austrian government." "Ah," said Poirot softly, as if the words confirmed some inner hypothesis. Monsieur Frobisher was not merely travelling for leisure. And you think it's connected? Poirot gave the faintest shrug. I think the dead do not circle newspaper articles in vain. The train had begun its slow approach towards LMC, a stop not scheduled for disembarkation, according to the original itinerary. Yet there, amidst a flurry of quiet activity, I saw a curious sight: a passenger alighting, his suitcase held awkwardly by one of the junior porters. He was an unremarkable figure, tallish, with thinning hair, and clad in a grey suit of the sort civil servants wear to avoid attention. I vaguely recalled him from the lounge the night before, reading the Neue Zeitung and saying nothing at all. He moved quickly down the platform, scarcely glancing back at the train. Poirot joined me at the window just as the whistle blew. Who was that? I asked. Monsieur Greenaway, Poirot replied at once. British reserved and travelling alone. But why would he disembark here? There's nothing at Zell but a post office and a ski chalet. Poirot's lips thinned. Precisely. He was silent for a moment, then added, This, Hastings, is not the sort of journey one breaks, unless one wishes very much to be elsewhere when a body is discovered. A thought stirred at the edge of my mind. Do you think he feared being questioned? I think, Poirot said, he feared being recognized. It was not long before the conductor, in his well-practiced tone of regretful diplomacy, began the unenviable task of notifying passengers of the incident. Word had already spread. Of course, tragedy travels faster than any locomotive, but official confirmation seemed to crystallize it. When the conductor reached Clara Markowitz's compartment, Poirot and I had just happened to be a few paces behind. I had not intended to linger, but something in her face compelled me. She received the news with quiet restraint, her lips parting slightly as if to speak, then closing again. Her eyes searched the man's face, not in disbelief, but as though confirming something already known. You need not view the body, the conductor said gently. We ask only if the name is familiar. She hesitated. Just a moment, but it was there. A flicker of something, recognition, or perhaps memory, passed through her features like the shadow of a curtain stirred by unseen wind. I do not know the man, she said at last. Julian Frobisher? No, I've never heard the name. Poirot inclined his head with polite gratitude and turned to leave. I lingered a second longer. Her hands, I noticed, trembled slightly at her sides, not violently, but with the kind of tremor one associates with suppressed emotion, or, I thought, with effort, the effort of maintaining a lie. She met my gaze briefly, calm, composed, but something in her eyes, so steady, so guarded, seemed to say, do not ask again. Back in the dining saloon, Poirot sipped at a lukewarm tisane, while the train cut through a narrow alpine pass. The landscape outside was breathtaking, peaks dusted in white pines standing in hushed reverence, but neither of us paid it much attention. Poirot had requested the full passenger register from the conductor, and now he examined it with the sort of quiet intensity he reserved for chessboards and murder scenes. He ran one finger slowly down the list of names, pausing once or twice with a faint narrowing of the eyes. Then he looked across the top, at the columns indicating cabin number, embarkation point, and any registered connections. When he reached the layout diagram at the bottom, showing precisely which passenger occupied which compartment, he remained very still for some time. You see something? I asked. Non, mon ami, I see something missing. He tapped lightly beside the number 4. The dead man had no official travel companion, yet the porter reported seeing 2 teacups in the wash basin when he cleaned the compartment yesterday. But that might mean, Poirot interrupted softly that someone else joined him. Briefly and unofficially, he folded the manifest carefully, then added, almost to himself, "It is a train of secrets, Hastings. But secrets, like steam, always find a way to rise." It was mid-morning when Poirot, with that particular air of subdued gravity which usually preceded a decisive moment, informed me that we would not be lingering over coffee today. "We shall instead take a small promenade to the luggage car, Hastings," he said with studied nonchalance. "It will be most enlightening." I followed him through the winding corridors of the train until we reached the forward carriage, where the conductor stood in hushed conversation with the baggage master. Poirot greeted them both with elaborate courtesy, and then leaned in, his voice pitched low. "There is, I believe, a matter of some delicacy. A certain Monsieur Frobisher, now deceased, may have been in possession of effects not properly recorded." The conductor looked uncomfortable. "We logged all registered items, monsieur. His 2 trunks were both labeled and stowed. Nothing unusual." Poirot gave a modest shrug. "Then forgive me, monsieur, but if we might briefly re-examine the storage compartment. One cannot always rely on trunks and tickets, n'est-ce pas?" The baggage master, an elderly Austrian with silver sideburns and surprisingly sharp eyes, looked to the conductor for instruction. A moment passed. Then reluctantly the man nodded. "I will permit it," he said. "But only under supervision." Poirot inclined his head. "Bien sûr, supervision is always preferable, especially when one is not certain what he is meant to find." The baggage car was heavy with the scent of worn leather and cold metal. Trunks of every size and nationality were secured with iron clasps and belts, the floor vibrating faintly beneath our feet as the train hurtled through another alpine corridor. The baggage master, lantern in hand, began moving deliberately through the inventory, ticking off entries against a clipboard marked with neat columns and small precise script. "Frobisher, 2 pieces," he muttered. "Marco which one? Vienna origin. Laszlo, military duffel, all in order." Poirot remained silent, his hands clasped lightly behind his back. It was I who noticed it first, a small brown valise, half tucked behind a row of tall trunks near the end of the storage rack. It was unmarked, unremarkable even, but it sat with that peculiar stillness that seems to mark objects deliberately forgotten. "No label?" Poirot asked, stepping forward. The baggage master squinted, then shook his head. "No, this was not tagged in Vienna or Paris, not logged at all." "Curious," Poirot said mildly. "And locked, yes, but an older clasp, not secure." The conductor looked wary. "If this does not belong to any passenger, then it belongs," Poirot interrupted gently, "to the mystery. And that, monsieur, is precisely why we must open it." With the conductor's solemn consent, the baggage master knelt and prized open the clasp. It gave with a reluctant click, releasing a faint puff of dust as though the case itself exhaled. Inside lay a modest assortment of papers, their edges yellowed and curling at the corners. They were bound in a bundle by a faded green ribbon, the sort one associates with old estates and forgotten wills. The documents bore seals, some cracked, others faint, as well as typewritten German and English lines that had once been crisp, but now looked softened by time. Poirot knelt beside them, his expression unreadable. "These are not travel papers," he murmured, lifting one with the care of an archivist. "These are records, transfers, wartime property declarations." The conductor frowned. What would a British attaché be doing with Austrian restitution documents? "That," Poirot said, "is precisely the question." He picked up a smaller envelope that had been flattened between the sheets. Within it lay a single black and white photograph, torn not cleanly, but with a jagged, almost angry edge. It showed 6 men in military uniform standing before a plain stone building. 4 wore German insignia. The 5th was unidentifiable. The 6th, his face had been ripped away. I leaned closer. Someone didn't want him recognized. Poirot nodded gravely. Or someone remembered too well. He placed the photo down, then straightened slowly. This valise, he said quietly, should not exist. But because it does, Hastings, one must ask whose name was removed, and who feared it would be known again. As Poirot gently turned the documents over one by one, I leaned in beside him, the chill of the luggage car having settled into my shoulders. The papers themselves were unremarkable at first glance, typewritten memoranda, correspondence bearing old military seals, forms filled with bureaucratic phrasing, yet they exuded something, an aftertaste of consequence. And then I saw it. One of the pages, a transfer letter dated December 1944, bore a faint, slanting signature near the bottom. It had almost faded into the paper, written in what must have been blue-black ink, the kind clerks used with fountain pens, before the war had bled all color from officialdom. I frowned. Poirot noticed at once. "You see something, Hastings?" Well, yes, I replied slowly. "This signature. I've seen it before." "Where?" "That's the odd part," I admitted. "I can't quite say, but it feels familiar. Not the name, just the way the F curves downward, and the sharp flick of the final." Poirot narrowed his eyes and nodded thoughtfully. "It is like a scent. One does not always recall from where it comes, but the memory, it stirs." He set the letter aside gently, as though not yet ready to confront what it might reveal. "Perhaps," he murmured, "you will remember when it matters." We returned our attention to the torn photograph, still lying beside the worn green ribbon, its edge curling as if recoiling from time itself. I picked it up again, this time studying it more intently. The uniforms were unmistakable, wear-marked officers, stiffly posed in a row before a small grey building. The date, if I judged the surroundings correctly, must have been taken toward the end of the war. Early 1944, perhaps even later. There were 5 visible figures. Their faces, stern, alert, too young, were turned toward the camera with varying degrees of unease. But it was the 6th man who held my eye, or rather, the absence of him. His body remained, a tall, straight frame, boots set slightly apart from the others. Yet the face had been torn away with such purposeful violence that even the collar of his coat had frayed. It was not the haphazard tear of time or carelessness. No, this had been done by hand, deliberate, furious. "Someone hated that man," I muttered. Poirot said softly, "or feared him." I glanced up. "Do you think it was Frobisher?" "I think," said Poirot, "that the photograph once told the truth, and someone wanted that truth to disappear, just as the man in the picture did." Poirot sat on one of the narrow benches that lined the interior of the luggage car, the bundle of documents resting neatly beside him. He held the photograph between thumb and forefinger, his eyes narrowing, not with emotion, but with precision. It was the look he wore when facts began to speak, faintly, and without permission. He examined the edge where the face had been torn. "It is not just anger, Hastings," he said at last. "This tear, it curves, you see. It was not ripped hastily from the edge inward, but torn deliberately from the center, away. Whoever removed the face was not destroying evidence. They were concealing only one man." I nodded, uncertain. "But the documents, surely those matter just as much." He picked up one sheet, an intelligence memo, marked confidential, detailing post-surrender asset recovery. His brow furrowed deeply as he traced the type. "This language, It is the kind used by those who hide truth beneath administration. Read this sentence: subject identified and returned under discretionary liaison orders, pursuant to neutral protocols. What does that mean, Hastings? I frowned. That someone was handed over, I suppose. But it's awfully vague. Exactly, Poirot said quietly. And vagueness is a language only fluent in guilt. He tapped the top corner of one document. These records did not belong to Julian Frobisher, attaché of cultural affairs. They belonged to a man who had lived two lives, one official, one erased. He looked up at me, his eyes dark. This valise, mon ami, belonged to a man who was not Frobisher. We were preparing to leave when Poirot paused once more beside the small brown valise. His eyes scanned it carefully once, then again more slowly, with a gentleness I have often seen him employ in moments of quiet revelation. He knelt and touched the metal clasp. "Hastings," he said, "do you recall how stiff the mechanism was when it opened?" "Yes," I answered. "It felt as though it hadn't been used in years." "Precisely. And yet, look here." He turned the latch gently upward. Beneath the curved lip, almost hidden from view, was a faint smear of something oily, clear, but unmistakable. "Lubricant," I said. Poirot nodded. "Fresh. And here the screws on the hinge, slightly abraded. It has been opened, tampered with, and then reset. Recently. Then someone placed the papers back inside after reading them, or," Poirot said, standing again, "after removing something else." He looked back at the now silent luggage compartment, his expression clouded. This valise was not hidden, it was planted, left here not to be lost, but to be found, and as we stepped into the corridor, the door hissing softly shut behind us, I could not help but feel that we had opened something far more dangerous than a case of old documents. Something had been waiting for us, and now it was awake. The corridor near the rear of the train was nearly deserted when I passed through it that evening. The hour had settled into that in-between quiet, neither quite daylight nor yet darkness, with the dimming sky slipping past the windows in an endless ribbon of violet and frost. It was there, near the final sleeping compartments, that I saw her. Clara. She stood quite alone, one gloved hand resting lightly on the brass handle of the outer door, her posture oddly still. Her head was tilted, and from her lips came the faintest whisper of a melody, barely audible, yet unmistakably haunting. A slow minor tune, as delicate as frost blooming across glass, and tinged with a sorrow so quiet, it seemed almost private. She was not aware I had stopped, or if she was, she gave no sign of it. Her gaze was distant, the tune threading from her as though remembered unconsciously, like something sung long ago to calm a frightened child. It struck me as strange, less the act itself than the quality of the music. There was an age to it, an ache, as if the tune had passed through war and silence, and only barely survived. Why, I wondered, would she hum such a thing now? Later, as I recounted the moment to Poirot over a pot of tisane in the dining car, his expression shifted subtly. He set down his cup and pressed his fingertips together, as he often did when retreating into memory. "You say it was a minor key?" he asked. "Yes, slow, the sort of tune one hears in a church with no congregation. Mournful, but strangely beautiful." He nodded, his eyes narrowing. "Ah, then I think I know the composer. It is likely the Lied ohne Hoffnung by Heinrich Geist." The name meant nothing to me. I must have looked blank. Geist was an Austrian Jew. Poirot continued quietly. A brilliant if forgotten composer. His works were banned under the Reich, not only because of his ancestry, but because his music spoke too plainly of grief. Even melodies can be seditious, mon ami. And this one, it was written in 1938, just after the Anschluss. It vanished for years, but during the occupation, Some soldiers, British, American, brought it back in whispers. Geist had died by then, of course, but the tune remained. I leaned back, the pieces half forming in my mind. So Clara, she must have heard it during that time. Poirot merely raised an eyebrow, or she remembers someone who did. The name Geist lingered in my mind, unsettlingly familiar. It wasn't one I would ordinarily recall, certainly not one I'd studied, but the moment Poirot mentioned that the melody had returned during the occupation, something within me stirred. It came not as a fact, but as a sensation, a flicker of candlelight, the musty scent of velvet curtains, a solitary figure at a piano, and then, quite suddenly, I remembered. It had been late 1945. The war was barely over. I had been stationed near Salzburg with an intelligence liaison group, and one evening, invited rather offhandedly to a recital in an old half-ruined concert hall. I had gone, more out of politeness than interest. The pianist had been German, the audience thin and silent, but the tune, yes, that tune, had floated out across the dim space and held us captive. There was no applause when it ended, only a sort of reverent hush, as though we had heard something forbidden. And now Clara, on this train, humming it without effort, as if it lived within her. But how had that moment returned to me now, through her? And more importantly, what did it mean? The opportunity presented itself not long after. We crossed paths once more near the lavatory door, and as fate would have it, no one else was nearby. I offered a polite nod, and she returned it, though faintly. Something about her bearing suggested distance, not rudeness, precisely, but defense. "I heard you humming earlier," I said gently. "It was quite haunting." She gave a small startled look, as if she had not meant to be heard. "Was I?" she murmured. "Yes, a piece by Heinrich Geist, I believe." At this she froze, not dramatically, but inwardly. A flicker passed through her eyes. She smiled, or tried to. "I'm afraid I don't remember, but you knew it by heart," I said, carefully. "May I ask where you learned it?" There was a silence then too long for comfort. Her hand touched her collar, her gaze shifted to the window. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I don't know." And with that, she turned away, not hurriedly, but with a quiet finality that said no more, and I, feeling suddenly foolish, could only watch her go, wondering who, or what, she was trying so hard to forget. We had returned to our compartment after dinner, the train rocking gently beneath our feet, when Poirot spoke again of the melody. He did not raise the subject directly, but his mind, as always, had been quietly circling it, like a cat around a locked cupboard. "There was a man," he said softly, "in Salzburg. His name was Ewald Spitz." The name meant nothing to me, but I did not interrupt. He was a music teacher of no particular renown, at least, not to the public, but among a certain set, he was admired for his work with children. He had a way of drawing expression from them, even the timid ones. It was said he could teach a child to weep through a single key. Poirot paused, fingers steepled. In the spring of 1944, there was a performance in a small municipal theatre, not grand, not celebrated, but it was permitted. The war by then had made everything strange. Grief could pass as obedience, if cloaked in proper measures. I recalled something, dimly. "They say he played a final piece," Poirot continued, "that same Geist melody, Lied ohne Hoffnung." No one applauded, no one dared. The room was full, yet silent, and within days, he was gone. Gone? Vanished. Denounced. Taken, perhaps. No one saw him again. He folded his hands. But the music remained. In the memory of those who had reason to remember, his words stirred something in me, like dust rising from a shuttered room. I hadn't thought of that night in Salzburg in years, but now, with sudden clarity, it returned to me. I could see the concert hall again, quiet and trembling under the weight of fear, not because of bombs, but because of what silence meant. And I remembered, yes, there had been a child. She had sat in the back row to the left, just beneath the broken sconce, a lone which had struck me as strange at the time. Children did not go to concerts alone, particularly not in that city, during that year. She was small, her coat too big for her, and she sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap. I recall watching her once or twice, because she didn't fidget, she didn't move at all, and now, as the pieces shifted into place with dreadful simplicity, I felt the blood drain from my face. It was her, I whispered. Clara, she was there. Poirot nodded, without surprise. Oui, mon ami. That performance may have shaped her more than anything that came after. She heard the melody once pure, and she has carried it ever since. There was a long silence between us then, companionable, yet heavy, the kind of silence that breathes more loudly than words. Poirot, as always, had sensed the tremor of recognition in me before I could give it voice. He leaned forward slightly, eyes soft, not triumphant. He was never pleased by grief uncovered. When a woman hums such a melody, he said quietly, it is not because she is nostalgic, it is because she mourns. The song, it is not a comfort, it is an ache. I said nothing, I could not. It is not only a memory of the man who played it, he continued, but of what was lost when he played. Safety, childhood, a world with rules. He looked toward the window, where darkness had long since claimed the mountains. She does not sing it for beauty, Hastings. She sings it because she cannot stop hearing it. That is grief, not loud, not theatrical, but persistent, like the drip of a tap at night. He folded his hands in his lap, and then more gently, tell me, mon ami, how does one comfort a child who was never allowed to cry? I had no answer. I feared Clara didn't either. The salon car that evening had an air of subdued civility, low voices, the gentle chink of cutlery, and a faint scent of tobacco and polish. The snow outside had thickened, pressing itself against the windows like a ghost begging entrance. Poirot and I had joined a casual card game at one of the smaller tables, seated across from a Hungarian gentleman of refined manners and a rather admirable moustache, Mr. Laszlo, formerly of the Austro-Hungarian diplomatic corps, or so he had told us. He had a way of speaking that made the past seem strangely accessible, as though memory were not a faculty, but a living companion always at his shoulder. The conversation at first lingered politely on politics, then music, and eventually, inevitably, the war. I recall one winter, Laszlo said, as he laid down a queen in Vienna, just before the collapse. We were housing British personnel in one of the requisitioned hotels, dreadful conditions. Half of them had no proper papers, no rank, no accountability. He chuckled softly, shaking his head. One fellow vanished altogether, just before a tribunal. It was whispered he had traded information for gold, clever enough to change his name, of course. He glanced up then, quite innocently. Frobisher, was it? No, that wasn't the name, but something like it. Rather Saxon. Something fabricated. I felt Poirot still beside me, though he gave no visible reaction. But in that moment something quiet and essential shifted. As the game came to a close and the others rose to refill their drinks, Poirot remained seated. He made a show of adjusting his napkin, smoothing the edge of his saucer, and then, with his usual understatement, turned to Laszlo. "Monsieur," he said, his voice light and precise, "you mentioned a man who disappeared from Vienna. A British liaison, non? May I inquire when this occurred?" Laszlo raised a brow, but seemed flattered by the attention. Oh, late 45. Just after the German withdrawal, but before the Soviets arrived in earnest. Things were chaotic. The Austrians had little authority. Even we had trouble keeping track of our own. And this man, Poirot continued, you say he was to be court-martialed? Laszlo nodded. It was whispered, yes. He had signed a falsified requisition order, one which later turned up in the hands of a black market dealer in Munich. The Americans were furious, but before the paperwork reached London, the man was gone. Poirot tapped his chin. Did anyone know his true name? Laszlo hesitated. Some suspected it began with a C, or perhaps a G. There were initials on a requisition form. EC, I believe. But they never matched any official file. Poirot gave a small smile. Merci, monsieur. That is most interesting. As Laszlo excused himself, I leaned in. You think it's Frobisher, don't you? Poirot's eyes glinted beneath his lids. I think, mon ami, that Frobisher may have been a name chosen not for its familiarity, but for its forgettability. Back in our compartment, Poirot drew out the manila envelope containing the documents found in the mysterious valise, the one not yet claimed, yet inexplicably linked to Frobisher. He spread them carefully on the fold-out table, each sheet handled with reverence, like pages from a book that had survived fire. He examined them again with his usual precision, yet I sensed he was not reading for content. His eyes moved differently now, not linearly, but across the margins, diagonally, as though listening rather than looking. Then with the gentlest murmur, he traced a fingertip across the lower edge of one typed requisition. Observe, he said, the faint pencil marks here, not part of the official type. I peered closer. Indeed, nearly invisible in the corner of the page, 3 neat letters had been penciled in block print. RSQ, initials, I asked. Poirot shook his head slowly. No, Hastings. That is not how a man signs his identity in fear. This is a code, a reference. He tapped the page once more. RSQ was the designation of a British logistics unit stationed near the Hungarian frontier in 1945. They handled high-level transfers of gold, art, and occasionally, personnel. I stared at him. And you think our Mr. Frobisher was part of it? Poirot did not answer. He simply folded the document back into the envelope. But his silence, I had learnt, was more damning than certainty. The dining car had just begun to refill for the evening meal. Poirot and I took our usual seats, and to my mild surprise, Clara entered moments later, taking a table not far from ours. She looked composed, perhaps too composed, with her hair smoothed precisely, and a faint application of rouge that seemed more defensive than decorative. Laszlo, arriving moments later, resumed his conversation from the salon car with a neighboring passenger. I doubt he even noticed Clara as he launched again into his recollections, this time more freely. Yes, he was saying, they found the stolen music manuscripts weeks later hidden beneath floorboards in a church outside Linz. But by then the man had disappeared entirely. Changed his name, his papers, even his accent, they said. Quite a feat, really. You'd have to be desperate. Clara froze, not dramatically, but with a sudden rigidity so total it was unmistakable. Her hand, halfway to her teacup, stopped mid-air. Her eyes fixed not on Laszlo, but on the wall behind him, or perhaps on a memory only she could see. Then, without a word, she rose. In her haste, her coat sleeve knocked something from her lap, a folded sheet of paper. I bent to retrieve it. It was old, thin, stained faintly at one edge, and on it, printed in a child's careful hand, were the opening bars of a familiar melody, the Geist tune. Clara did not return, and I wondered, was the tune hers or someone else's? That evening Poirot sat opposite me in the dim quiet of our compartment, the passing snow outside reduced to a slow, hypnotic blur. He leaned forward, fingertips steepled, his eyes not on me but somewhere in memory. "Hastings," he said gently, "you recall, perhaps, the whispers, the scandal during the occupation." I blinked. "Scandal?" "There was an officer, a British liaison," he said softly, "accused of handing over civilians, refugees, partisans, perhaps even informants, to the Gestapo. The facts were never made public, none." I frowned, reaching back into those war-heavy years, into the half-remembered atmosphere of shifting allegiances and clumsy bureaucracy. "There were always murmurs," I said at last. "A man stationed in Vienna, or was it Prague? He was under investigation, but then the trail vanished. No arrest, no report. Some said he'd been reassigned. Others claimed he'd defected, but no one could prove anything." Poirot nodded gravely. "And the name?" "I can't recall," I said helplessly. "There were initials floating about, EAC, or maybe CDR, the sort of thing that circulated in mess halls after midnight over a bottle of gin." Poirot looked at me steadily. "And do you recall Mon Ami, the woman who disappeared shortly after? A pianist's daughter, she had been in the care of the British consulate. Her name, Markowitz," I said before I could stop myself. Poirot's gaze softened, and a long silence bloomed between us. Suddenly so much of the snowbound tension on this train felt older than the journey itself. The next morning, Poirot summoned me early. The train had paused at a small alpine station, and through the frost-hazed window the peaks rose like white ghosts. He laid the contents of the so-called Mr. Frobisher's valise before me, not the contents, mind you, but the documents, each one official, each one pristine. "And yet, there," he said, pointing delicately, "observe the passport issued from Vienna. British consulate stamp, yes." I peered. "Yes, dated April 1946. Indeed. But Hastings, I have written to consulates before. I know their habits, their petty details, and look at the seal, the spacing, the lack of embossing." I frowned, beginning to see what he meant. Poirot handed me another. "And this travel affidavit, dated the same week, uses a different typeface, and the signature, no consular officer would sign in that manner." I stared at him. "You mean these documents," Poirot said calmly, "were forged. Expertly, but forged nonetheless. Someone went to great lengths to construct a new identity, but they forgot one thing, mon ami." "What's that?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "The small details. Always it is the small details that betray the great lies." Later that day, in the stillness of the drawing car, Poirot placed one slim finger upon the cover of the passport and said quietly, "This man Hastings was not Monsieur Julien Frobisher at all." I felt the bottom drop out of my stomach. He waited until the hush of the train seemed to amplify the words that followed. His real name was likely Friedrichs, Kapitän Wilhelm Friedrichs, formerly of the Abwehr, the German intelligence division, transferred to Vienna in 1944 to handle civilian logistics. A collaborator, perhaps worse. But the British passport, Poirot gave a gentle, almost pitying smile. Stolen, perhaps issued to a true Frobisher, a junior attaché who never returned from a border crossing. Friedrichs merely adopted the name and, with the aid of forged documents, slipped into post-war obscurity. From there it was not difficult to fashion the role of a minor diplomat. I could hardly speak, but he was on the Salzburg express. He dined with us. He asked after the weather. Poirot's face did not waver. "Why?" And the murderer knew him, recognized him for what he was. Perhaps they had been waiting years. Perhaps they followed him across countries, watching for the moment his guard would lower. I whispered, "And they struck in the night." Poirot nodded slowly. There are crimes, Hastings, that take but a moment to commit, but there are others that ripen like old fruit, bitter, bruised and waiting to fall. I sat alone in our compartment that evening, staring down at the list of passengers Poirot had obtained, and then to the torn photograph we had recovered from the valise. A line of men in uniform, their faces grave, all but one, whose head had been ripped clean away. Clara's reaction now made sudden horrible sense. The music fragment, the flinch at Laszlo's words, the refusal to look upon Frobisher's body. It wasn't grief, it was memory. You see it now, mon ami, Poirot said gently from the doorway. It was not jealousy, not theft, not inheritance. It was older than that. I looked up at him. Justice, I said slowly, or revenge. Poirot tilted his head. The two, as you know, are sometimes mistaken for each other. I swallowed. But who would? Poirot's eyes turned toward the corridor. Someone with a long memory. Someone who has waited not for opportunity, but for proximity. He sat beside me and folded his hands. Sometimes, he said, the past does not sleep. It rides the same train. It waits in the next compartment. And when it strikes, Hastings, it does so not out of rage, but remembrance. And I found, to my quiet horror, that I believed him. The snow beyond the glass shimmered in pale drifts, and a hush had settled over the observation lounge, the sort of hush one associates more with a cloister than a train. Poirot and I were finishing our coffee when Miss Markowitch approached us, her face drawn yet composed, as if weighed by something too long carried. "Mr. Poirot," she said quietly, and then glancing at me with something close to apology, "Captain Hastings, may I speak with you both?" In private, there was nothing theatrical in her manner, no trembling of voice, no staged fragility, only a calm, exhausted necessity. Poirot inclined his head with grave courtesy. "Mais bien sûr, mademoiselle." She led us to a corner alcove where the lamps flickered faintly in rhythm with the train's motion. For a moment she seemed to struggle for words. Then she folded her hands tightly in her lap, as though anchoring herself to something solid. "I have waited a very long time," she said softly, "to say what I am about to say. But I believe I must." Poirot nodded once, and I saw his gaze sharpen. Not with suspicion, but something gentler. Expectation, perhaps. And so, in that dim corner of Europe rolling by, the silence began to break. Poirot, always prepared for the moment that opens a sealed heart, reached into his pocket and drew out the torn photograph. The same we had retrieved from the mysterious valise, its ragged edge whispering of something violently erased. Without a word, he laid it gently on the small table between us. Clara's breath caught. Her eyes dropped to the image and did not rise again for several seconds. "I know that picture," she said, her voice barely audible. "It was taken in Salzburg, late '44. My father had begun teaching again, quietly, under curfew, music students who had no place else to learn." She reached out a hand, not to touch the photograph, but merely to steady herself near it. "That's him," she whispered. "Professor Emil Markowitch. I remember the coat, the one with the buttons too high, and the music book in his lap. They never let him keep that book." Poirot did not interrupt. He merely inclined his head, inviting her to continue. Clara's fingers brushed her lips. "The man whose face is torn away, he was the one who came that night. I didn't know his name then, but I remember his boots, and his voice." Her eyes lifted, filled not with tears, but clarity, "and now I remember his smile." Clara's voice settled into a rhythm, low and steady, as if she had told herself this tale 1,000 times in the silence of her own mind, but never aloud. "It was the end of January," she began. The snow was so thick it choked the chimneys. My father insisted on giving a lesson that night. A boy named Lucas, barely 15, he had promise and hope, though both were dangerous things then. She folded her hands tightly again. The man came at dusk. He was dressed as an Allied officer, British, clean-shaven, too clean. It made the local women whisper. He carried a leather folder and spoke perfect German, but his accent was wrong, too polished, too careful. Her eyes grew distant. He said he was there to ensure safe passage, that my father would be granted temporary asylum, to teach in the West even. My father believed him. I swallowed hard. Clara's voice caught, just once. He asked for tea. I made it. He and my father even spoke of Brahms. And then there was a knock. 3 men, plain clothes. They took him without raising their voices. Poirot leaned forward gently. "And you never saw your father again?" She shook her head. No trial, no letter, not even a name. Just silence. "Poirot, madame?" And the officer? She looked down at the photograph once more. I never forgot the voice, and I never forgave the smile. "When I boarded this train," Clara continued, her voice so calm it chilled me, "I saw him standing in the corridor, slightly bent, grey at the temples, a copy of the Times under his arm. He turned as I passed. There was a pause, a hush, laden with more than memory. He smiled when he saw me." Poirot said nothing. His eyes, deep with thought, remained fixed on her face. "It wasn't recognition," she added, almost bitterly. "No, not in the way one might expect. It was as if he had forgotten entirely what he had done, and yet felt entitled to the pleasure of greeting an old acquaintance. I felt something turn uneasily within me. I said nothing. Clara whispered, "Not then, not when they announced his name, not when I heard it at dinner, but I knew." Poirot spoke softly. "And did he know who you were?" She shook her head. "He didn't have to. That was the cruelty of it." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "To him I was no more than the daughter of a man he erased." Poirot folded the photograph once, gently, as though returning a burden to its box. In that moment I felt it fully, that the motive behind this murder was not revenge, but remembrance sharpened into something far colder, something almost just. As Clara Marcoche's voice faded, the silence between us returned, but this time it had changed its shape. It no longer bore the weight of waiting, but of something more dreadful, the sense that something irreversible had already passed. I looked at her, at the woman I had watched from across the dining car only days ago, whose hands trembled when she stirred her tea. There was nothing uncertain in her now, no hesitance, no outward display of regret. Her bearing was one of quiet resolve, almost resignation. And yet, I could not bring myself to meet her eyes. I wanted desperately to believe in her innocence, that she had come here only to unburden herself, that she had recognized a ghost and chosen to speak the truth. Nothing more. But the calm precision of her recollection, the curious absence of fury or sorrow, it disturbed something in me. She had not wept. She had not faltered. She had told us a story that should have shaken the walls, and then she had simply stopped. Poirot, ever still beside me, gave no indication of what passed through his mind. But I knew him too well. He, too, had heard what was not said. It was Poirot who broke the quiet, not with an accusation, but with the gentlest inquiry, so gentle, in fact, that it might have passed for concern, had it not been for the way his eyes never left her face. "Madame," he said softly, "I ask now only as one who seeks the symmetry of truth. On the night in question, did you speak to him? Did you leave your compartment?" Clara did not answer at once. She drew a long breath, the kind one takes when steadying oneself before a confession, or a lie. "No," she said at last. "I did not." The pause before those words had not been long, but it had been long enough to scrape something raw. "I stayed in my berth," she continued. "I heard the porter's footsteps just past midnight. I remember because I had only just turned off the light. But I did not rise. I did not knock at any door, and I most certainly did not speak to that man." Poirot inclined his head. "You are quite sure?" Her gaze did not flicker. "Absolutely." There was a quiet finality to her tone. She folded her hands once more, as if to close the matter herself. "I came here to tell you what I remembered," she said. "That is all." She rose then, not abruptly, but with a kind of grace I found more unsettling than any display of emotion, and as she left I realized I no longer knew whether to pity her or to fear her. We remained in the alcove for several minutes after she departed, not speaking, not even shifting in our seats. The stillness was complete, as though words might somehow fracture the room and spill out all that had been left unsaid. Outside, the pale light of morning had begun to break over the snow-laden firs, but it brought no warmth to the thoughts that hung between us. I looked at Poirot, hoping, as I often did, for certainty, for the sharp precision of his logic to sweep away doubt like mist before the sun. But his eyes remained on the door through which she had passed, and in his expression there was no triumph, no clarity. Only sorrow. "She is a woman of strength, n'est-ce pas?" he said at last. "And strength, mon ami, can sometimes wear the face of peace." I nodded, though I was unsure what I agreed with. Her story lingered in my mind, like the ghost of something that might be truth or might be performance, and her denial, so calmly delivered, felt neither wholly false nor entirely clean. I leaned forward. "Do you believe her, Poirot?" He did not answer. He only reached for the torn photograph once more and folded it with exquisite care, as if some things, once opened, could never truly be put away again. The morning following Clara's quiet confession dawned cold and heavy, with the mountain air pressing against the train windows like a held breath. Poirot, ever restless when a matter remained unresolved, had taken to examining the practicalities of our environment, the doors, the corridors, the unseen workings that kept the train in motion. It was during one such inspection that he asked, with that curious mixture of humility and command he so often employed, to be shown the storage compartments at the rear of the train. The conductor, clearly uncomfortable at the deviation from protocol, nevertheless complied. Together we followed him down a narrow service corridor that reeked faintly of metal polish and coal soot. He unlocked a low utility locker tucked behind a stack of coiled signal rope and oil cans, muttering that it hadn't been opened since the journey began. Poirot bent low, his fingers light and precise. From behind a wedge of canvas, he extracted a single leather glove, dark brown, its surface worn smooth, but not from recent use. He held it delicately, as though it might vanish in the touch. "Ungant," he murmured, "and not of the working class, mon ami. Observe, the stitching, the cut, this was made for a gentleman." But there was something else, something his expression noted before his voice did, yet it was hidden. Why, I wonder? Poirot turned the glove over in his hands, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. I leaned in to inspect it for myself, and it was then that I noticed the peculiar marking near the cuff. "Look here," I said, pointing. "There's something on the leather, a residue, wax perhaps." Indeed, just above the stitched hem of the glove, a faint ring of pale yellow clung to the surface. I touched it lightly with the back of a knuckle. It had the slick feel of sealing wax, not fully hardened. Above it, a faint smear of ink, black, but broken as though rubbed in haste. Poirot regarded the marks with reverence, as though they were sacred inscriptions. "You are observant today, Hastings," he said approvingly. "It is indeed wax. A seal, I suspect, and the ink, perhaps from a fountain pen hastily concealed." He frowned. "A letter, sealed and written, handled with this glove, then either lost or discarded deliberately. But why here, and why only one?" The question lingered, heavier than the object itself. I looked once more at the glove. It was unassuming, elegant, yes, but otherwise ordinary. And yet, as Poirot returned it to its resting place in the locker, I could not help but feel it pulsed with quiet significance. We returned to our compartment in a silence that Poirot, I knew well, reserved for moments of quiet synthesis. He had not yet spoken aloud his conclusions, but I could sense that something had stirred, some new shape taking form in that meticulous mind of his. Once seated, he unfolded the overnight train schedule with particular care. His finger moved slowly down the list of stations from Zurich to Bregenz, from Lindau to Salzburg, noting each halt and its duration. Then it paused, not dramatically, but with the deliberateness of someone who had seen exactly what he had hoped. "Oberlindau," he said softly. I frowned. "Hardly more than a maintenance stop, isn't it?" "I don't remember us slowing," he nodded. "Precisely. A brief halt in the dark, not listed for disembarkation." He tapped the timetable once more, and then folded it shut. "Tell me, Hastings, if one wished to step off a train unseen, and then reboard it later, where would one choose?" "Oberlindau," I said, the name now tasting different on my tongue. "It's remote, no official platform, no scheduled passengers, no questions asked." Poirot smiled faintly. Exactment. And in that faint curve of his lips, I sensed he had just uncovered a moment, perhaps no more than 30 seconds in the journey, where the impossible had quietly occurred. Poirot, being Poirot, did not let the matter rest. Before the noon hour had struck, he had located the senior porter, a wiry, hollow-cheeked fellow named Brenner, whose reluctance to speak was matched only by the nervous energy with which he polished the brass door handles. They spoke just outside the luggage car, beneath the hum of the overhead wires and the rhythmic clatter of steel on steel. I stood at a discreet distance, watching Poirot's method in action, his voice calm, low, almost paternal. "You have served many years," Poirot said gently. "You know every noise, every light, every anomaly." Brenner gave a slow, grudging nod. "Then perhaps you will recall something unusual from last night. A shadow where it ought not to be. A delay at a door, a step in the snow." The man hesitated, his gaze darting behind him, as though someone might overhear what he wished to forget. "At Oberlindau," he said finally. "The train." It paused longer than it should have. I thought perhaps there had been a signal error, but as I passed the third coach, the one with the first-class berths, I noticed the side door was ajar. He swallowed. It shut quickly. No one was meant to disembark, but I heard footsteps in the gravel, and a moment later, someone reboarded. Quiet, but hurried. Poirot inclined his head gravely. "And you reported this to no one?" "There was no proof, and besides," his voice dropped to a whisper, "I've worked too long to go stirring ghosts." "Ah," said Poirot, as if that were the most natural explanation in the world. "But ghosts, monsieur, often require just a little coaxing to speak." As we made our way back through the corridor, the steady rhythm of the train lending its usual hypnotic pulse, Poirot was uncharacteristically quiet. He often withdraws into his own mind when assembling the fragments of a puzzle, and by now I had learned better than to disturb him in those moments. When at last he spoke, his voice was deliberate, calm yet laced with something steely beneath the surface. "Hastings," he said, tapping his fingertips together, "this glove, the wax, the ink, They speak, do they not? I nodded, though uncertain of their full meaning. He continued, this was not simply a murderer in disguise. No, no, let us think beyond the obvious. A conductor, perhaps, but only for a moment. He impersonated authority, yes, but only to gain passage, not to belong, but to move. To move where? I asked, genuinely puzzled. Poirot raised his brows. To the compartment of Julian Frobisher, with no suspicion, with purpose. It dawned slowly. You believe he posed as a railway courier? Mais oui. Not a passenger, but a courier, slipping aboard at Oberlindau under cover of darkness. A uniform, a glove, perhaps a forged manifest. Enough to walk unseen, strike, and then vanish. I felt a chill gather at my collar. The thought was terrifying in its elegance. Poirot requested, with a courtesy so crisp it bordered on martial, to examine the storage carriage again, this time focusing not on what was hidden within, but on what sealed it. The customs latch, he said, intrigued him more than anything stored behind it. When we arrived, the porter hesitated, but Poirot's eyes, calm, unreadable, seemed to dispel resistance. The latch bore the official wax seal of the Transit Authority, unbroken, smooth. At a glance there was nothing amiss. But Poirot, of course, looked not as others do. You see, Hastings, he said softly, the devil is always in the detail. Observe the embossing. What do you notice? I bent lower. The crest was familiar, the wax pale ochre, but the shape, it's off-center, I said slowly. And the letters, not aligned. Très bien, you see it. He glanced at the porter, who looked increasingly uncomfortable. Poirot went on, this was not placed by a customs officer last night. It was forged, likely hours later, perhaps with an old stamp, one retrieved or stolen. And the wax, not from the regulation box but a substitute. The color is similar, yes, but the texture, too soft. But why reseal it? I asked. Poirot gave a slight smile, to suggest nothing had been disturbed, to lend the illusion of continuity, that the chain remained unbroken, and suddenly, I understood. If the seal was false, then the access had been real, and whoever had used it had counted on us never looking close enough to tell the difference. As the train wound along the glacial valley, its rhythmic sway almost hypnotic, a weight pressed against my chest, not panic, nor dread, but the recognition of a truth I had not dared consider before. I turned slowly to Poirot. Good Lord, I said, if someone boarded at Oberlindau dressed as a courier, planted that forged seal, delivered, or retrieved, something from the compartment, and left again before the train moved on. Oui, mon ami, Poirot said, not looking up from his notes. Then we have been looking too closely at our fellow passengers, and not at the space between the stops. The killer, I said softly, might never have been on this train at all. He nodded. And that, Hastings, is why our little circle of suspects has proved so unsatisfactory. The crime was planned by one outside the circle, one who entered it only for the act itself, and then slipped away like smoke. Outside, the landscape narrowed into pine and fog, and inside, the mystery widened. Not just who, but when, how, and why. The Grand Hotel Salzburg possessed a sort of imperial melancholy, old-world chandeliers flickering just above the cusp of shadow, velvet chairs arranged with the ceremony of a forgotten era. It was in the lounge, a room perfumed faintly with pipe smoke and alpine lilies, that Poirot had asked all remaining passengers to convene, and though no official charge had been laid, each one entered with the tense deference of those called before a magistrate. Lady Hartley sat bolt upright, her gloved hands folded so tightly in her lap they seemed fused. Mr. Laszlo, beside the drinks trolley, struck the pose of a man listening intently while trying not to seem anxious. Even young Stephen, usually a symphony of restlessness, had gone uncharacteristically quiet. Clara arrived last. Her coat remained on, buttoned high, and though her face was composed, I sensed in her a fragile readiness, as though something within her had already been decided. Poirot stood near the fireplace, his hands lightly clasped behind his back. He made no movement for several moments. The hush was absolute. Outside, the faint sound of wind pressing against the terrace windows only heightened the sense of suspended judgment. Though I had stood at his side through 100 such gatherings, I could not shake the feeling that this one was different. Not only because the crime had followed us across borders, from the rails of Europe into this quiet Austrian salon, but because Poirot himself looked uncharacteristically grave. Something more than justice, I felt, was about to be spoken. "My friends," Poirot began, his voice measured, not loud, yet it seemed to carry effortlessly across the room, as though every syllable were weighted and placed. "You may wonder why I have asked you here, why after such a terrible incident, we do not leave the matter to the authorities." He paused, letting the question settle into the minds of his listeners. "It is because," he continued, "the truth must be not only found but understood. The death of the man you knew as Julian Frobisher was not, as some perhaps hoped, an unfortunate accident. Non. It was, in every sense, a reckoning." I noticed Lady Hartley shift uncomfortably. Laszlo lowered his eyes to the carpet. Clara, however, did not blink. Poirot paced slowly, hands still behind his back. "For many of you the name Frobisher meant little. A quiet man, a retired diplomat, a passenger like any other." But he stopped, looking around with those piercing, unsettling eyes. "Names can lie. Faces can lie. The past, however, does not." He tapped a finger to his temple. "It remembers, like a clock wound long ago, it ticks silently in the background, until its hour strikes." He turned now, facing us all. "And so we find ourselves not in the middle of a tragedy, but at its long-delayed conclusion. A conclusion set in motion not yesterday, nor last week, but years ago, in another time, in another war." The hush deepened, yet the tension grew, a room waiting to hear the name of the ghost it had unknowingly entertained. Poirot walked to the small table where he had earlier arranged several objects, the valise, the photographs, a leather-bound folder stamped in worn diplomatic red. With meticulous care, he lifted a single sheet and held it aloft. "This," he said, "is the original documentation of the man known to you as Julian Frobisher, a passport, forged, yes, but clever, not British, but Austrian in origin, created post-war, and later transferred under the seal of the Allied Commission. It passed every casual inspection." He laid it down and lifted another. "But this was hidden beneath the lining of his luggage, a certificate of commission, Luftwaffe. The name Captain Otto Friedrichs." There was a visible intake of breath from several in the room. Even I felt a tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with the fireplace's heat. "He was," Poirot continued softly, "a man who vanished in the winter of 1945. A man believed to have been captured by the Allies, but whose name never appeared on any prison register. Why? Because he had changed it, and with it his life." Poirot let that hang before continuing. "For 30 years he lived as another man, traveled, advised, joined clubs, attended musical evenings, but in Vienna, during the war, he denounced civilians. He wore the uniform of the Reich, and he was responsible, among other acts, for the betrayal of a Salzburg professor arrested in December of '44. Poirot turned toward Clara. "A man who taught music." A man who never returned. Clara did not flinch, though I thought her hands resting in her lap trembled just slightly. Poirot inclined his head with quiet respect. "Mademoiselle," he said gently, "you have carried a silence longer than most would bear. The man who smiled at you in the corridor, the man who offered a toast on the second evening, was the same who stood in your family's doorway that winter, the one who with fluent German and polished English promised protection and delivered a rest." There was no accusation in his voice, only the gravity of recognition. "You remembered not only the voice," he said, "but the gesture, the way he closed the coat at his collar, the rhythm of his walk. You remembered, but you said nothing." Clara's eyes, when they met Poirot's, held something far older than grief. "I thought I would forget," she said at last, "that I had. Until he smiled at me the way he did when they took my father." Her voice did not waver, though mine surely would have. Poirot nodded. "It was not the law that brought him to justice, mademoiselle. It was truth, and truth, however long delayed, must be given voice." He paused. "You did not strike the blow. I believe that, but you carried the burden of memory, of music unfinished, and perhaps of waiting." In that moment there was no more mystery in the room, only history, long buried, and now finally unearthed. Poirot allowed a moment of breath to pass before he resumed, this time walking slowly toward the edge of the circle. His tone shifted, less elegiac, more pointed. "We have spoken of the victim's identity, but now we turn to the matter of how he died, and by whose hand. For the murderer, Mes Amis, was not the ghost of the past, but someone with flesh, intention, and remarkable cunning." He gestured delicately toward the small leather glove on the table beside the passport documents. The glove, found in the utility locker of the train's rearmost carriage, a compartment no passenger should have had cause to enter. A conductor's glove, it seemed. Yet one unlike the rest, slightly worn, unpaired, and on its cuff, sealing wax. Red, official, but on close examination, old, dried, flaked. His eyes narrowed. One of the train's custom seals, on the rear supply door, had been carefully removed. A counterfeit pressed in its place with an outdated embassy crest. A crude forgery to most. But to one who has spent a career studying detail, sufficient to raise the alarm, I felt a cold clarity unfold inside me. "The killer," Poirot said softly, "was not listed among the passengers. He boarded at Oberlindau, under cover of night, impersonating a railway attendant. A wartime trick, yes, but the war, n'est-ce pas, taught many such tricks to men who never intended peace. And now I understood why he had stared so long at the timetable." Poirot's voice changed again, softer, as though what followed must be handled not merely with truth, but with a kind of reluctant reverence. "There is one among us who has listened more than he has spoken. A man who kept to himself, watched, learned, and waited, not out of timidity, but out of purpose." He turned, and for the first time that evening, addressed Mr. Laszlo directly. "You, monsieur, you whose documents were in perfect order, you who claimed a business appointment in Geneva, you whose silence hid not guilt, but grief." Laszlo did not move, not even to blink. "In 1944, your village in northern Hungary was seized. Your parents, both teachers, were deported on the orders of the local liaison officer to the Gestapo, a liaison who wore no German uniform, but who gave information freely in exchange for his own safety. Kapitän Friedrichs." I felt the air shift, not violently, but with the heavy finality of a stone sinking beneath still water. "You tracked him for years," Poirot said, patiently. Through Budapest, through Zurich, through changes of name, of posture, of accent, until at last, aboard this train, you saw the ghost, clothed in flesh. Still, Laszlo said nothing. I cannot admire what you did, Poirot continued quietly, but I understand what you carried. Laszlo inclined his head, not in pride, but acknowledgment. A soldier's gesture perhaps, though no uniform remained. Poirot turned again to the group. Though the room had drawn so still, it seemed no one breathed. The method, he said, was elegant, cold, military, not dramatic, no, but effective. He gestured toward the papers once more. A needle, dipped in aconitine, the alkaloid poison derived from monkshood, administered in the form of a minute injection behind the collar, painless but swift. Death followed hours later. The symptoms mimicked heart failure, but the bruising on the skin, though faint, did not lie. I recalled then the subtle shift in the doctor's tone when he had first examined the body, the uncertainty that hadn't seemed important until now. The opportunity came at 2:13, Poirot continued, when the train stopped briefly at Oberlindau. You, Monsieur Laszlo, boarded in a conductor's coat, passed through the rear car unnoticed by the staff, who were momentarily occupied with a burst pipe in the kitchen galley, and entered Frobisher's compartment with forged service keys. Poirot's voice grew quieter still. He saw you, he recognized you, and he smiled. The words dropped like stones in a still pond. You had waited so long to see that face, but not with fear, not even with remorse. He smiled, as if to say you were too late. Laszlo closed his eyes, and I wondered if the memory haunted him more than the act. Poirot bowed his head. It was not a crime of passion. It was a sentence passed, but it was vengeance, not justice. For several minutes, no one moved, no one spoke. The fire in the grate continued its soft crackle, but it seemed somehow distant, like the echo of something remembered, not heard. Poirot returned to his seat, slowly. There was no trace of triumph in his bearing, only weariness, and something I had seen but rarely, regret. Justice, when it arrives by the proper road, has a dignity to it, but justice that arrives through back alleys, cloaked, uninvited, leaves the room colder than it was before. I looked about me. Lady Hartley sat rigid, her face unreadable. Clara stared at the floor, her expression not one of satisfaction, but something far lonelier. Even Stephen, usually incapable of stillness, now seemed almost reverent, as if something sacred had just taken place, or been broken. I tried to find my own thoughts, but they were muddled. I could not say whether I felt sorrow, or relief, or something uncomfortably close to admiration. I knew only that something final had passed between us all, a truth laid bare that could not be undone. Poirot folded his hands in his lap. There are crimes, Hastings, he said softly, that are solved with the law, and others with the soul. The difference lies not in evidence, but in the echo they leave behind. And that echo, in that velvet-draped room, lingered long after the last word had been spoken. There was a stillness to the morning, a kind of suspended breath that seemed to hang over the Grand Hotel Salzburg as we prepared our departure. The sky above was a pale, unbroken grey, the mist from the surrounding hills drifting low, threading through the windows like a memory reluctant to part. I had risen early, not by choice, but by the pull of unfinished thoughts. Poirot, as ever, was composed. His valise stood neatly beside the door, his coat brushed and folded across his arm, each gesture as meticulous as though we were departing a formal gathering, not the scene of unspoken grief. "Do you feel lighter, Poirot?" I asked quietly, adjusting the clasp on my bag. He turned to me with that enigmatic look, unreadable, but never unkind. Non mon ami, he replied, almost inaudibly. We leave with fewer questions perhaps, but not fewer burdens. The porter waited by the stairwell, the brass fittings of his trolley dulled by the damp. As we stepped out onto the stone path, I cast one last glance behind me at the window of the drawing-room. The curtains were drawn. The truth had been laid bare within those walls. But peace, it seemed, had not followed us out. It was only once we were seated in the carriage, our trunks stowed, and the horses nudging forward through the morning fog, that I realized something, or rather someone, was missing. "Clara," I said aloud. She wasn't at breakfast. Poirot nodded, his gaze fixed absently on the window glass, where droplets of condensation traced slow meandering lines. "She left Hastings, before first light." "Left, but why no goodbye? She is not a woman who values farewells," Poirot said gently. "She values silence, as she always has." I frowned, the unease stirring in me difficult to name. A moment later, the concierge, breathless from haste, reached our window and passed Poirot a small object, a folded piece of parchment, slightly frayed at the edges. He opened it with care. It was sheet music, handwritten, the notes spare, trailing off as though the melody had not yet decided how to end. At the top was a name, Sonatine pour un âme perdue, no note, no explanation. Poirot closed it slowly and slipped it into his breast pocket. "She has said more with this than 100 letters, Hastings," he murmured. And I had no words to disagree. Above the curling roofs of Salzburg, beyond the frost-dusted arches and narrow lanes, stood a modest stone chapel nestled in the shoulder of the hill. Tourists rarely ventured so far. It was not marked in any guidebook. Yet someone had gone, alone and unseen, before the town had yet woken. Clara stood in the small nave, her coat buttoned to the throat, her gloved hands steady as she placed a single white bloom, narcissus perhaps, beneath a plaque worn by time. The name was still legible, though the stone had weathered, Professor Stephen Kohler, 1883-1944, Musician, Pair. There was no service, no candles burned, no priest stood watch, only silence. Clara knelt for a moment, not out of formality, but as though trying to draw near to something she could not touch. Her brow did not crease, her eyes did not weep, but her fingers trembled ever so slightly as they lingered over the stone. A gust of wind stirred the petals of the flower, and the chapel's wooden doors shifted slightly in their hinges. She did not stay long. Some goodbyes, I think, are not meant to be witnessed, only felt in the quiet corners where the heart keeps vigil. As the carriage wheels found rhythm against the slush-mottled stones, I noticed Poirot tilt his head slightly, as though listening for something just beyond hearing. Outside the window, the first snow had begun to fall, not a blizzard, nor even a proper storm, but that early kind of snowfall which comes without warning, as though the sky had tired of holding its sorrow aloft. The mist thinned at the edges, revealing the mountains in passing glimpses, tall, immovable, yet half swallowed by cloud, like truths uncovered too late to change anything. Poirot remained motionless, his expression unreadable but weighted. "I wonder," I ventured, "do you think she'll find peace?" He did not answer at once. Instead he spoke softly, not to me but as if summing something to himself. "The truth, mon ami," he said, "is not a balm, it is a mirror. One may gaze into it, but it offers no comfort for what it reflects." There was no bitterness in his tone, only acceptance, and for a moment I understood that for all his genius, for all the logic and the certainty he carried, even Poirot could not repair what truth sometimes broke. That evening, as the train gently rocked us toward Vienna, I found myself staring through the glass at the blackness beyond, broken only by the occasional flash of a station lamp or the shimmer of distant village lights. Poirot had closed his eyes, not asleep, but folded into that curious quiet he reserved for journeys whose purpose had shifted from solving to remembering. And then, faintly, impossibly, I thought I heard it. The melody, Clara's melody, not through the walls or the cabin door, not in the physical sense at all, but in the recesses of memory where certain notes take root, the unfinished sonatine, the trailing line of a refrain that lingered long after the composer had fallen silent. I closed my eyes, and it was there, soft, incomplete, as though she had left it unfinished by design, and I understood. Some stories are not solved, only spoken, some griefs not overcome, only worn like a threadbare coat. As the train pulled forward into the deepening dark, I made no remark. For once I let the silence speak, and it did, not with answers, but with the sound of something carried, and never entirely let go. Some truths do not shine, they echo, soft as snow falling on old stone. Vengeance may wear the mask of justice, yet justice, when silent, leaves its own chill behind. The past was not buried on that train, only unmasked and mourned. Do you believe the heart ever forgets, or does it simply learn to live with the remembering? If this story stayed with you, give it a quiet like, and share your thoughts below. Don't forget to subscribe for more journeys into shadow and silence.